Welcome to this afternoon's panel on Mythbusting. This is on overcoming myths and misunderstandings in order to improve congressional and executive branch cooperation in oversight. And I'm Kristine Simmons. I'm with the Partnership for Public Service. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs here. And I was very privileged to work with my colleagues in 2015 on a report that is called Government Disservice. You have a copy of it on your chair. And we approached this report originally with the notion that we would figure out how congressional dysfunction really impedes the executive branch and all the things we need to fix about Congress. And when we approached the interviews, we quickly learned that it's really a two-way street. And there are so many opportunities for Congress and the executive branch to engage more effectively, but they need a better understanding of each other in order to do that. And so we really found that there are a number of myths on both sides of the aisle, or about both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue and the branches, including the notion, and some of you might think these are not myths, so that's another thing that we'll have to test. But that hearings are gotcha exercises designed for media consumption or to score political points, not for problem solving. That agencies are more interested in sharing marketing materials than real information. The interests of agency leaders are best served when they keep Congress at a distance, exception the appropriators. Nobody said that should happen. And these are just a few, and I would encourage all of you to reflect on your own assumptions about the branches as you listen to the conversation today with this panel. So I'm very delighted to introduce several terrific people who have a breadth of experience that is hard to replicate, and I wish I could share their bios with you in full because they have some phenomenal experience, and including bomber pilot here and other things. So I encourage you to dig more into their backgrounds, but I'm going to start left to right. Kristine Hill, who is the Majority Staff Director for the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, Subcommittee on Health. Portia Bamiduro, the Chief Counsel for the Minority for the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. So that's PSI. If any of you who were hearing Senator Levin talk a few minutes ago about his PSI experience, that subcommittee is still going strong, so we'll hear more from Portia. Vince Micone, the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs and Senior Counselor for Management at the Department of Homeland Security. And I feel like he's accruing more titles as by the day, so if that wasn't right, Vince, or you've added more, let me know. Tim Camus, who's the former Deputy Inspector General for Investigations in the Office of the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. And I wanted to take a moment to mention that in 2017, Tim received the Partnership Service to America Medal for Homeland Security and Law Enforcement for his leadership of a team combating IRS telephone impersonation fraud. And that's something that he worked on with the Hill, so we want to hear more about that. This is my way of plugging the Sammys. We would love to have nominations. The nominations period is open now, and oversight stories are a terrific treasure trove of good ideas about the ways in which civil servants are serving the public. So I encourage you to nominate a federal employee for a Service to America Medal, and there's a flyer on the back table along with some of our case studies around oversight. And then last but not least, Alan Slobodin, who is the Chief Investigative Counsel for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations with the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. So thank you all for being here. We talked earlier, this is going to be a conversation, so we hopefully will not get too raucous, but really want it to be an interesting and engaging conversation for all of you. I'm going to start off and put some questions to the panel, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. So let me start with a general question for everybody, and I'm going to start with you, Kristine. What is a myth or a misconception about the relationship between Congress and the executive branch that you believe gets in the way of constructive oversight?
I would say, at least from my experience with the House Veterans Affairs Committee and having come from the executive side working in Veterans Affairs as an assistant secretary, one of the myths is that everything is a gotcha, kind of almost as you mentioned, like with the hearings. So many times we just need information. The congressional staff is trying to address a policy, an idea from a member. We may not know if it's good or bad, trying to tease out some of those unintended consequences. And rather than waiting for a legislative hearing, we really want to try to get solid policy, solid ideas, good facts. And so many times, there's this barrier between the executive and legislative branch in that any question I answer can be used against me. And so I think so many times when a congressional staffer is asking a question, it's not necessarily to get someone in trouble. It's more to get a better idea as to what the real facts are and to be better informed.
Thank you. Portia.
Sure. I think I would just build upon what Kristine said, and I would add that one of the myths that I think is permeating this discussion right now is that we on the Hill come at an investigation and we view ourselves as opposing parties to the executive branch, that we are foes in this oversight process. And I don't think that to be the case at all. I think particularly from the perspective of PSI, we come at an investigation really as fact finders. And we view the executive branch to be our partners in that process to try and help us find helpful information. We don't come to an investigation with our minds made up about what has happened. We really come to them with what we see to be an issue that needs illumination or some light shined on it, and we're just trying to get the executive branch to partner with us to give us the information so that then we can follow the facts where they lead us.
Vince, do you have a different perspective maybe?
I don't, but as a career federal official and someone who's actually newer to legislative affairs, I actually went over to our legislative affairs shop about a year ago, having only worked with the caucus when I was an intern way back when. So my view is that oversight makes federal programs stronger. And we need to make sure both with our overseers on the Hill and with those investigative bodies like OIGs and GAOs who provide oversight, that we remember that the purpose of the oversight is to sometimes find fault, but even when that is happening, it's to make the federal government stronger in serving the American people. So I think sometimes on both sides we need to step back, remember the greater function that we're serving, in the greater purpose we're serving, then come back on our side in the government, making sure that on the executive branch we are being open, honest, and transparent in providing information to appropriators and authorizers so that they can do their job, which in turn will help us make our make us do our jobs better. Yeah, we know in hearings there's always going to be bombs thrown on either side. But if you step back from that and get to where a lot of the real work is done, which is before the hearings, then I think we can develop very productive relationships, even though we may not necessarily agree all the time on everything.
Tim.
Thanks. Thank you. As a career law enforcement person, I will tell you the biggest myth that is out there is that it's impossible to share information with the legislative branch on ongoing investigations. That is not true, but it has to be done very carefully. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So we all serve the American taxpayer. The American people are our number one interest and worry. And there are times that we can't share information and work collaboratively with the Hill. But I will tell you, in the interest of America, when that opportunity presents itself, we all need to take it. And one of the cases that I'll talk about at the end is a very successful case where we were so concerned about Americans getting scammed by the IRS impersonation scam that during an ongoing investigation, we regularly briefed the Special Committee on Aging, and it worked out great because I think between the two of us, we protect a lot of innocent Americans from getting scammed. So I think that's a myth.
Thank you. Alan.
Building off of the previous comments, don't assume a negative. So from a congressional standpoint, if you're the oversight person, don't assume just because you're not satisfied with the answer or with the pace of the response, that means assume a bad motive on the part of the executive branch. And as someone I think had mentioned earlier, if you're in the executive branch, don't assume a negative on the oversight request or that there's some bad motive behind that. And to the public, don't assume just because this is happening in Washington, and you got Congress and the executive branch involved, that they're not people of goodwill really working in good faith to try to solve problems and deliver for the American people.
So I think that's an interesting note, that there is a lot of goodwill and a lot of cooperation that's happening behind the scenes that the American public might not know about. And I would love for you each to touch on some examples of that cooperation and collaboration in places where you feel like oversight was yielding some real tangible benefit. And Portia and Tim, I thought maybe we'd start with you because you've worked together in the past.
Sure. Tim and I were brought together, I guess it was back in 2014, I think, when I worked on oversight and government reform for Ranking Member Cummings. And we were working together on what was a very politically charged investigation. At the time, it was the investigation into the IRS's scrutiny of 501c3 organizations. And so that one was a pretty politically charged investigation, but I didn't let that impact the way that I approached the IRS or TIGTA for information. And hopefully, Tim will agree, I think we were able to establish and maintain a really good working relationship over the course of that 18 to 24 months.
Yes.
And I just viewed it as it was my responsibility to try and get the information that would keep my boss informed. And Tim, I will say, to his credit, bent over backwards to get us the information that we requested. He made himself available to us. And I think the lesson that I took from that was, even when you're working in a tough investigation that has a lot of political ramifications, I think you can put all of that to the side and focus on the goal of trying to conduct oversight. And we were able to get the information that we needed to keep the American people informed. And I think we formed a really good working relationship over the course of that investigation.
Right. And just to build on what Portia said, at the end of the day, you have like-minded individuals in both the legislative branch and the executive branch. We all take our job seriously for the most part, and we all just want to serve America. So when you have like-minded individuals that just want to do the best for the people, good things can happen. And as Portia pointed out, the most important aspect of it is just building a relationship. You know, you have to have relationships, and you know, in your own lives and your own careers, that's the most important thing that you have. So we were able to build a trusting relationship under very difficult circumstances. And because of that, and because we both wanted to do the same thing, which was to serve America, I was able to share the information that they needed on the Hill for their purposes. And I knew that they would respect our interests in keeping as much of that information undercover as possible so that we could resolve our investigation. So it's a two-way street, but it starts with the relationships and working with like-minded individuals that are just interested in serving America. And it's very fulfilling when that happens.
And just proof positive of the relationship, when Tim and I haven't seen each other in probably 2 years, but when we saw each other today, we hugged because we actually really did have a really good working relationship, and I think that's possible. I think it's possible.
Great.
Can I just ask a question up there?
Sure.
So,
I'll get you a mic, sir.
in the IG's office? Were you in the IG's office when you were working together?
Yes,
So you weren't actually IRS. You were the IG for IRS.
I was the IG over the IRS.
So,
Right.
just saying.
And I could also say we had great working relationships with folks at the IRS as
Right.
well.
Right.
Yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. It wasn't just that because Tim was at the IG.
Right.
We had great working relationships with our executive branch counterparts at the IRS as well.
Do any of those still work there?
Yeah, there's a lot of people still at work there. So.
Yeah, it's true.
And
We'll
another,
get there, Ann.
Yeah, if I may, just one other quick example, and that is on the impersonation scam. So how many of you either received a telephone call claiming to be from the IRS, or a loved one has, okay? So in the heat of all that, there were about 400 new victims a week that were actually paying money. And when I talk about victims, let's humanize it. These are people that are elderly for the most part, and they're losing their life savings or their ability to live in any situation. So if they were in a nursing home or assisted living, all their money went to the scammers. So while this was going on, our counterparts at the Senate Committee on Aging, they were getting calls into their hotline. And they would call us and say, hey, we just got some fresh calls in. And we'd say, all right, well, here's what we're doing about it. And I would share information. They held numerous hearings on it, which helped us get the word out. And during those hearings, I was able to testify about the scope and manner of the scam without disclosing any grand jury information, which is secret, or betraying our ability to conduct the investigation, because we don't want to tip our hand on how we know things or what we know. But we worked collaboratively, and just like with Portia, we built really good relationships, so they understood what my limitations would be as we testified about this. But at the same time, because they have the ability to reach a lot of people, we work together to warn people. And we think, you know, just based, everybody's about results if you're a federal manager. We think that through that collaborative effort and the media that we were able to get out, we probably reduced the percentage of victims by 90%. Because in its heyday, like I said, it was 400 new victims a week that we were tracking, and we know there were a lot more. And then after a lot of the things that we did, a couple of the hearings, we were down in the double digits. So it really does work, and we really did help each other.
And Vince, let me pick up on that note and ask you to talk about how DHS has leveraged its congressional relationships. I'm thinking in particular in response to disaster recovery. DHS is never not in the news, but when you think about all the hurricanes and the storms that we've had, how do your congressional relationships for the department come to bear in your response?
So we have, particularly in terms of responses to hurricanes, fires, very open relationship with members of Congress and their staff to share information about all aspects of what we're doing. So, and I can personally talk about what we did just a few months ago when we were facing the hurricanes that hit Florida. A few days before those even started hitting, we began sharing with members of Congress in affected or potentially affected areas what the response was going to be, what we were pre-positioning to support that, and setting up a process by which we could talk to folks as we were going through response and recovery immediately, staff and members, through daily and sometimes twice daily calls. One, so that we could learn if there were critical unmet needs, and two, to share information and basically bust myths about what we were doing and how we were supporting state and local officials. I remember, you know, a couple calls in these where senators and members would get on and have very specific questions about specific communities that were impacted. That information helped FEMA and the department react very, very quickly to address those concerns. And that sort of goes into the recovery aspect of dealing with storms like the hurricanes or the wildfires, and that's a different response that we do than the immediate response. But we view these as long-term partnerships with congressional staff and members, because often they help provide us information that can help us be more effective in responding to and supporting state and local officials as they're doing what they need to do to handle the emergencies at hand.
Can I jump in on that just real quickly, and kind of to piggyback on that, and also to talk more about just the value of relationships? Having been in VA in the executive branch, and knowing that VA's emergency preparedness sector is very talented and has a very robust program, that it was one of the bright spots of Katrina. And then coming back on the Hill, and with the latest disasters, we weren't getting that type of information coming from the agency. But I knew that they were doing good work. So just having that kind of bit of a relationship and going back to the agency and saying, you need to be pushing this information out to your congressional delegations, to your committees. Tell the good story, get them involved, and exactly like you said, I mean, they're on the ground in the district. They can help the agency in DC. So again, that's a perfect example of an agency and Congress working together to get to a solution.
So Kristine, on that, and I'm sorry, Vince, go ahead.
We also help, frankly, members and staff get to the scene if they need to. And before we even have our calls with members of Congress and staff, the first thing we have is a call with all the interagency partners so that we actually have good, up-to-date information on the response that's going on in the federal interagency. Everywhere from VA to what HHS might be doing, led by FEMA, with NOAA to find out what's happening in terms of the next storm fronts that might be coming, so that when we actually get on the calls, and frankly those are usually right before, so the information is very handy and we can answer those questions right away. It's been very effective, particularly this year.
And Kristine, let me ask you, and I want to come back to that, Vince, but we had a deputy secretary tell us when we were working on this government to service report that he evaluated his congressional affairs staff by how effectively they kept the political leadership off of the Hill and away from the Hill. How do you educate or persuade agency leaders that it's in their interest to develop these relationships?
Yeah, I think that's probably the worst possible advice. The more these agencies are up, educating, talking to staff, and I know one of the myths you had in there is, that congressional staff is inexperienced. Well, how do you fix that? You get out on the Hill, you talk to the staff, you get them involved, you get them knowledgeable in the programs, and to the myth, most, especially committee staff, is extremely talented, very smart, and if they don't know something, they will quickly pick up on it. So to say stay off the Hill, I think is a disastrous course of action with regards to getting your agency what you need and what you want. And it's almost a guarantee that you're going to get legislation coming down the pike that is unfunded and unwanted. And so I can't imagine a deputy secretary saying that. Off the soapbox.
Okay. And Ellen, on that note, from your perspective being on the Hill, many of the investigations that you work on are long-term. These are things that take place over not weeks, but months and years. And how do you work on relationships with career people who are going to be there a while, that's one thing, but when there's short-term political leadership that's turning over on a regular basis, how does the need to have productive relationships come into play in that kind of environment?
Well, it depends. It depends on the type of investigation. It's in the nature of the topic. I mean, the long-term issues, sometimes we call them evergreen, because they're recurring issues. That you're usually dealing with career staff on, and the politicals will know that that's a long-standing issue. So the relationship that will come into play is the relationship you have with the agency and the subject matter experts that are involved, and the history of that relationship and building trust to the way you conduct yourself. And I think with regard to career staff, you hope that you convey that you're an honest broker, that you're going to give them a fair shake, that you understand you know what you don't know, and they know, and the agency subject matter experts know a lot, certainly a heck of a lot more than the committee staff. So you go in there with some humility, and go in there and just be fair-minded, and most of all, show real sincere interest in what you're looking at, because chances are the person at the agency's reason they're still there and been working on it for such a long time is they have a passion for what they're working on, or they have a commitment to it, or certainly mission-oriented, depending on what type of subject matter we got. With regard to politicals, that's going to depend a lot, too, on, well, you're talking about administration of the same party or the opposite party. Now, from where I'm coming from, it shouldn't matter, but we know human nature, that, It'll be a little more challenging if they're not at the same party, but again, it's about establishing you're going to be fair and a straight shooter. And if you can convey that, chances are, even if the political's on the other side of the aisle, you can still build a good working relationship.
Could we get there in a minute? Portia, could I actually ask you to talk about that a little bit? PSI has developed a reputation over many years of being able to operate successfully regardless of the political environment. I shouldn't say regardless, but maybe it's in spite of the political headwinds or who's in the White House or what's happening outside. So could you talk about what is it about that subcommittee in particular that seems to work so well?
Sure. I think it's sort of been built into the fabric of PSI that our investigations are going to be done on a bipartisan basis. And so I think when we come to an executive branch agency with a request for information and we present a united front, the agency knows that we're serious about the request. I think the other thing that helps build the reputation of PSI is that we conduct all of our investigations in secret. So no one knows what we're doing until we have finished our investigation and we're ready to release a report or have a hearing. And we've built up a reputation of holding very tightly the information that we acquire over the course of the investigation. It does not get leaked to the press. And I think defense counsel who are representing parties on the other side and then the executive branch agencies know that when they give us that information, we're going to use it properly. We're not going to disclose it inadvertently or intentionally until it's time to do so. And one of the other things that we do is we give all of the vested parties an opportunity to see what we're going to make public before it goes public, and we give them an opportunity to weigh in with their concerns. And so I think all of those factors have helped establish the reputation at PSI and allowed us to do really good bipartisan work.
Okay, Vince.
Yeah, I can attest to that. PSI is tough. We see them a lot at Homeland Security because they're in our oversight group. And sometimes one of the things, particularly with PSI staff, they'll want a lot of information. So sometimes what we try and negotiate is, look, for all the stuff you want, it's going to take this amount of time. Help us figure out the important things that you want first, because we'll get you everything you want. But we need to identify what we can get you that's most valuable early on. And that's really where the negotiations and the discussions and the collaboration begin so that we can help the investigators do what they need to do. You know, I tell my colleagues, unlike fine wine, withholding information for a long time doesn't do anything except get people really grumpy when your secretary goes up to testify at a hearing that he or she needs to go to. So it's our job to make sure that we satisfy the needs that our overseers have in a timely way and not blow them off. And if we need to give them realistic expectations of timeframes, then we have a responsibility to do that and say, this is why. And I always believe that when you do that, if you can provide some information as a good faith effort, it helps everyone move along and build the trust that you need to have the sort of relationship that is most productive.
And if I could just add to that, we love having those negotiations. We fully understand that sometimes the information that we are asking for is voluminous and it will take a lot of time to put together. But rather than, and I've seen some agencies do this, and I don't advise it, to just ignore the request or say we can't get you anything, that is an ill-advised approach. I think the much more preferable approach is to say, help us help you and let us prioritize the information that you want first. And we're very, very willing to have those conversations. And as Vince noted, it improves the relationship that you have. And we're all trying to get towards the same goal, I think, of transparency.
So, Tim, do you have a
Yeah, if I may, just from the other side of the equation, at the end of every letter, there's a phone number and there's a name.
Yep.
And when you get those letters, you read them, and then if you have any questions, you call the person and you call them and set up a meeting to talk to them. And that will really help you understand exactly, as Vince pointed out and Portia, you know, what do they really need right away and what are they trying to do? And then as the executive branch side, if we have specific concerns or we have an angle that we're looking at and it's very sensitive to what we're trying to do as far as a criminal investigation, that again is our opportunity to say, okay, great, we're glad you're looking at this issue, but we're in the middle of something that could turn criminal. So to the extent possible, please continue to keep this very, very carefully guarded, because it could jeopardize a criminal prosecution. And again, it's all about the relationships and trust. And the only other thing I'd like to add to what they said was, and Alan touched on it too, from the recipient side of the letters and the meetings, it's always better if it's bipartisan. And that helps with the trust, because then when you have both sides of the aisle in the room or on the requesting end of it, you know that there's not going to be punches pulled, or one side won't get the information ahead of the other side and then try to make you look bad with the other side. If possible, if you get both of them in the room at the same time, you can really build that trust factor.
So one tip, both to executive branch and to congressional branch. On the executive branch, you need to make sure that you have the right person at the right level who can make the decisions. So oftentimes, I see and have seen, and frankly had an experience with PSI, where someone pretty deep within our organization was dealing with a very important response, and frustration was really building, and I finally heard about it, and I was like, no. We got to get on the phone instead of shooting emails back and forth, which are like the daggers where no one has a good understanding of what's going on, so that we could start being productive in terms of providing information. So on our side, we have the responsibility to make sure that we have the right decision maker who can be engaged in those discussions. And on the Hill, if you see us not, you need to give a call to the Ledge Affairs shop and say, help, we're getting nowhere and this is not going well and my boss is getting really pissed, and we know what happens when that happens. And that usually will get people to engage at the right level to make sure that you get what you need.
And I'm going to turn it over to the audience in but a couple more questions. I wanted to bring up or ask about GAO, because often the Hill will use GAO as part of its it is the investigative arm of Congress. From the perspective of our executive branch panelists, how do you engage with GAO in a way that is productive and helping you advance your mission within the department? Does GAO help you do that sometimes? And what would you say about those investigations or inquiries that you get?
You or me first?
You, please.
All right, so when DHS was set up, 22 different organizational cultures coming together in one agency. Not clear lines of management established and direction on how we were going to accomplish missions or how we were going to integrate missions. GAO quickly said you got to focus on management issues, and they put us on the high-risk list. For some of you who know, being on the high-risk list tends to be someone's entire career, because you don't graduate unless you really graduate from that. So when I started at DHS in management, prior to coming to OLA, one of the issues we had is GAO would send out their annual report on high-risk lists. We were doing all this stuff, we were sending reports, but we were not making any progress. So we said, wait a minute, let's get together with the GAO team, and we invited them over for pizza, for which we all paid for ourselves, got in a table and said, okay, we feel like we are in a cage just keeping on spinning, and we're giving you stuff, but we're not giving you the right stuff. We're not having a dialogue about where the goalposts are, and we're not really understanding what you think we need to do specifically to address these management issues at Homeland Security. And so that was the start of a process that went on for several months until we got to the point that we knew what we needed to provide in reports. We agreed on a frequency of how we were going to provide those reports. We agreed on ways that we were going to have our lines of business communicate on a regular basis with parts of the team that were working on this. And we, all of our meetings when we came together, and we involved leadership, which was also very key, the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary, where we met twice a year with the Comptroller General and the leads of the teams and talked about what was going on. But we developed a common framework of how we were going to report progress to GAO. That resulted in the last time that we went before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, we had our Undersecretary for Management next to the Comptroller General, who said, they're not done yet, and I always reserve the right to change the score, but they're a model of how you respond to and address these issues. And that was really a turning point where we said, and we had a horrible relationship with our IG as well, where we said, we're all on the same team, we all work for the same government, your job is to help us make us better. We're not always going to agree, but let's at least have discussions about how we can set goalposts that we all understand so that when we're giving you information, it is, one, helpful to you, and two, it helps you understand what we are doing. So we're very proud of that. We're actually very proud of the fact that we got information sharing, which was also on the high-risk list, how we share information with state and local officials about law enforcement matters within our jurisdiction. That came off the high-risk list based on the communication about what we were doing day to day with them. And now we meet, in fact, yesterday, I believe we had a town hall meeting with GAO, and a few weeks ago we had a town hall meeting with the Inspector General, Acting Inspector General at DHS, where we had conversations with people who are working in all of these matters on a regular basis about how we can better communicate. And I would say also that oversight goes to people like the Partnership for Public Service, who points out our survey scores every December when they do their best places to work, but also is an additional way that the public has an impact on making sure that we're doing right by our employees and doing right by the nation in what we do.
Thank you. Tim, did you want to add to that?
We had a little different relationship with GAO because I'm with an Office of Inspector General, and our focus was the Internal Revenue Service as our only oversight. And naturally, GAO was also interested in the Internal Revenue Service from their position. So our audit staffs would meet annually and go over the audit plans to make sure that, understanding that the IRS was just trying to do their mission and they didn't want to be over audited or dual audited. So to the extent possible, you know, we would meet and negotiate with GAO to make sure that there weren't overlapping coverage of the same issue. And there were occasions where investigations would be of interest to GAO, and we would approach it the same way we did with our colleagues on the Hill. You know, it serves no useful purpose trying to put things in a silo and siphon. It causes more problems. So to the extent that you can legally and without betraying the investigation, the more information you communicate, the better. So it was a little different. We weren't the victims, I guess, with GAO so much as we both had a mission of oversight.
And last question for me before I turn it over to all of you, and we'll start with Kristine and work our way down the line. But if you could talk about the value of getting off of the Hill and going and seeing and visiting with the agencies and talking to the people who are doing the work in the executive branch, how does that benefit the oversight that you're trying to do?
For our committee, it's very valuable because what happens in DC at central office and the policies that are pushed out, what's actually going on in the field with the over 157 medical centers who are all, some of them are their own little entities, and they're not all run exactly the same. For us to go out in the field and actually talk to the people on the front lines, actually talk to the leadership in these facilities, and understand what they are hearing getting pushed out of DC, how they're interpreting it. Probably most of you are aware we had this big VA scandal starting in 2014 that led to some very significant groundbreaking legislation that really changed the way community care was provided to veterans. But in going out in the field, we're also often told, well, Congress said we had to do it this way. And you'd be looking at these very dedicated professionals, you're like, that's not what Congress said at all. It's like, well, that's what we heard. And so by us going out and finding out, you know, how is this information being disseminated, how is it being interpreted, and how the policy is being implemented was very important for us to come back to DC, work with central office, and try to get everyone pretty much on the same page and to create a better functioning agency overall. So for us, going out in the field is very valuable.
Likewise, I would just add, the way that PSI traditionally operates is we send out document requests and/or subpoenas, and we'll get hundreds and thousands, if not millions of pages back in response. And that information is very, very helpful to understanding the topic that we are investigating, but I don't think there's any substitute for actually going out and seeing how a program works up close and personal. And we had a chance to do that a couple of times over this past Congress. One in particular, we were investigating how synthetic opioids, and I can say this because it's now public, how synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl, were getting into the United States through the international mail system. And you think you understand how mail works until you go to a mail facility and see the volume of it. Seeing those words on a page means nothing until you can actually see it up close and personal. And so it really changes your perspective about the oversight that you're conducting when you can see how constrained they are by resources, how many people that they need, or how old the equipment is that's running the mail services. So I don't think there's any substitute for actually getting out of your office and going to meet with the folks in the executive branch to see how they are operating the programs on the front line.
We have about 100 committees that claim some sort of jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. It's my friend and colleague, Tia Johnson, who used to be our Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, can note we have a whole calendar of CODELs and staff DELs so that we can keep up with who's going where. But one thing we're doing that I'm very excited about is I've worked very closely with our folks in management to build a tool where we actually, for the new Congress, will be able to provide a one-pager for every congressional district that will share information about our resources in that district so that the members will have at least a place to start in their district, to the point where we'll be able to identify in the general number of employees who are there, where we have major facilities that they may not even be aware of. And even, this was like they threw this in that I was really excited, we'll be able to share with members of Congress in their districts how much contract spend we have in that district. And so we are doing this as part of a very assertive way. I ran the presidential transition for DHS before I took on this role. And I learned a lot from that. And one thing is that in building a good relationship, you need to have good information at the beginning. So we are going to be sharing information with all members of Congress very early in the new Congress with information about what resources are in their district, who they need to call for information, generally what sort of time frame we need to establish visits in the district so that we can do that well. These are things that we're going to do to start a productive relationship on the early end so that staff and members will know who to be in touch with, particularly when you've got so many new members coming in. And also they'll have a sense of what DHS has that's in their district.
Tim?
For us, we're not as exciting as DHS. We had one mission, and that was to make sure that the things at the IRS work properly. But because we were a law enforcement agency, we were a little different than most IGs because we also had a threat mission. So anybody that made a threat against an IRS employee or a facility, our agency would investigate those to the tune of about 3,000 of those a year. Very serious threats, by the way. So we had some very robust law enforcement equipment and capability that most IGs don't have. So we would always talk to the Hill and our oversight committees about coming out and allowing us to give a demonstration some of the challenges that we had because we weren't a typical IG. And we thought it was very important that they understood some of the things that IRS employees were facing in the field and also some of the needs that we had for appropriations purposes that were over and above what a typical IG shop would have. So I thought that was very helpful, and we did it with OMB as well, because there's a misconception about, you know, what do you need as a tool as an executive manager or federal manager, and what are you doing with the money you get? How wisely are you spending it? So I just recommend anytime you get an opportunity, look for these ways that you can show people on the Hill what you're doing for America and what are you doing with the money that you get in your agency. I think it's critically important.
Alan?
Just want to reaffirm what my colleagues said. I mean, going out in the field is invaluable. It's nothing like seeing what is going on the front lines. And to see if you're looking at different field offices to see if there are differing interpretations of regulatory requirements and consistencies in the way regulations are implemented. I mean, it's tremendous. Going out in the field is it's part oversight. I mean, that's a lesson of history. You can just start with the Truman Senate Committee and government contracting waste during World War II. All they did was going out to shipyards and around the country to uncover waste. So that's a great point.
So thank you. And with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to you. I'm going to start over here. We have a microphone that Dan will walk around. And if you could please identify yourself, and then we'll go to questions. And then I'll come back over here.
Hi, I'm Hillary Dickinson with the House VA Committee. I'd love to hear the panelists' opinions on offices of Ledge Affairs, Office of Congressional Affairs. I know from a Hill staffer's perspective, it's very easy to view an OCLA as somebody who, I'm trying to talk directly to a VA employee and get, their direct facts, and then OCLA comes in and tries to whitewash something or just, kind of give me the party line. So I'd love to hear the panelists' opinions on how do you make that, how do you make OCLA productive versus just kind of a middleman.
Let's start with Vince and Kristine, who have both.
Yeah, that was a nice
Saying
pivot
that,
here. So, look, one of the things that I have told our staff, our career staff in particular, is you've got to be on the Hill for our Ledge Affairs folks. Sometimes they'll be more comfortable being at 7th and D, hanging out, clearing email. That's nice, but you need to be on the Hill. You need to know staffers on our committees of jurisdiction. You need to build relationships with them, so that when they have questions and they want to speak to a subject matter expert, you can help make the connection and get the information and the people available that they need. And so I think there's a balance, obviously, that we need to draw with making sure that we are communicating the administration and the department's perspective on a particular matter while making people available to staff and to members to give firsthand experiences about what's going on. So there is a balance that we need to do. And OLA, or Congressional Affairs, or whatever it's called, our job is to make sure that the balance occurs and that the information gets out the door. So I'm always calling saying, where is this letter? When are we going to get the person over? Who's going to make the call? Get it done and let me know when it's done. So a lot of what we need to do is play traffic cop to get you the information you need. But you also need to hold us accountable if you feel like we're whitewashing you. Then we need you to say, okay, you need to get us some folks unhindered that we can have some conversations with.
And I swear Hillary was not a question plant from my side. But having been an assistant secretary for Congressional Affairs in the executive branch, and also being on a committee that has jurisdiction over that same branch, it is a balancing act. And when I was in the agency, my philosophy was push out as much information as often as possible. Almost overwhelm the committee with facts. And so, if you keep giving them things, they're reading it and they're having to have a hard time coming back with too many questions. But I also, again, kind of the relationships, I got to know my the staff directors very well, and the staffs, and had no problem picking up the phone and calling whenever anything was starting to look like there might be an issue growing, just to give them just this is coming. You don't want to hear it from the press first. That's like the worst thing that can happen. And so it got to be where I was calling the committees 2 or 3 times a week, usually on Friday afternoons, because that seems to be when bad news comes out. And just a little anecdote, I called one Senate staffer, and he was like, okay, Kristine, what is it this time? And I said, I was just calling to say have a really nice weekend. And he just started laughing, because he's like, you're the relative that it gets appointed to call everyone else when somebody dies. So I was like, so it got to be where anytime they saw my name, they were going to get some information. Usually it wasn't good, but at least they were getting a heads up, so that they weren't surprised and their boss could be a little proactive on finding the information. On the committee side, I do get a little frustrated in that sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we just want some information. We want to talk to a subject matter expert who can explain a particular program or some nuance of a program that we're just not sure of because somebody's looking at legislation. and having to, and I know the purpose of OCLA is to stay on message, to keep the secretary informed as to what the interest is and kind of a flow of information. But when it becomes more like a gatekeeper, and I can't just ask a simple question without going through several layers and multiple, well, we'll get that coordinated for you. It's like, I just need an answer for information. It's not going anywhere. So it's a tough balancing act, but I think for those in the agencies, recognizing that sometimes, information is good, and sharing of that information and keeping those lines open to the best of your ability is productive for both sides.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Dan Frumkin from White House Watch. I feel like a lot of what you guys have been talking about have been examples that take place in a universe where people are sort of fundamentally on the same side. There's turf battles, there's bureaucratic issues, there's misunderstandings. But what about when they're not on the same side? I mean, looking forward to the next few years of Democratic oversight, I can't imagine you're going to have a lot of Trump political appointees being willing to answer questions about the, incredibly deep levels of misconduct and corruption in their agencies. So what, so you mentioned responding to the Congress about the hurricanes in Florida. What about the hurricane in Puerto Rico? What about when there is stuff that they're trying to hide? I got a sense from Alan that maybe the subtext here is you need to talk to the career folks rather than the political folks. But on the other hand, I also hear that you can't reach the career folks because the political folks are in the way. And I also wonder how much pressure the career folks are under from the political folks. So, I mean, in that universe, how do these dynamics that you're talking about play out?
See if anybody wants to take that. But I will say this, the purpose of this panel is to talk about places where collaboration does happen and cooperation does happen. So we purposely have a positive.
Well, I will say, having been in an administration with a Senate and House of a different party, those relationships can work. They can happen. You have to keep talking. If it becomes a solid wall, and I've been a political and I've been a career, it's got to be focused on, again, kind of steward of the taxpayers' dollars and making government work. And if a relationship doesn't exist where the two at least are not talking to each other, then even if you agree to disagree, we're at standstill.
But can you keep talking to the non-political folks?
We have been, yes,
They know my number.
yes.
So, so there are different forms of collaboration. So, sometimes you have a situation where you could say everybody's on the same side, and that's, maybe those are not the most visible issues, and they're not in the public light, or partially in the public light, and their collaboration can work real well. Then there's the category, there are going to be investigations that have a lot of visibility, where the issues are such that it's, the agency is going to be feeling besieged. If it's out there in the press, they got a committee that's out there sniffing around. And what I want to convey is, even in that type of situation, if you have if you can establish good working relationship with your counterpart, or help convince them of the value of cooperating, at least collaborating, for example, what was discussed before about negotiating a request to make it more targeted or more sensible, that helps the committee get to the facts a lot sooner, doesn't waste a lot of time with the agency. Work out a level of trust so that you can talk to people with firsthand knowledge or your subject matter experts. If the nature of the issue is such, you really need to talk to those people. That's the only way you can conduct good oversight. But the other piece of this is, in talking about those types of investigations, that's where bipartisanship becomes very, very important, because I think if you got a bipartisan investigation and the majority is of a different party than the executive branch, if they can bring along the minority with them, that's going to get different handling than if the investigation's perceived as partisan. So the idea is to conduct, if possible, bipartisan investigations, or to the extent possible where they might not necessarily be bipartisan on its face, the minority can play a very important role as being an honest broker to help facilitate these investigations and to keep things on track.
Is that reasonable in the next 2 years? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I do.
Other
I
questions?
don't really anything
Yes.
else.
My name is Bethany Carter. I also work on Veterans Affairs on the Hill, so I'm particularly interested in Kristine's perspective. But I have two somewhat related questions about public trust and all of this, and they also both have to do with not just interpersonal direct contact with OLA, but also any sort of public oversight functions, hearings, letters, that sort of thing. The first question is, have any of you dealt with situations where oversight of an agency or vice versa working on an oversight issue, investigatory issue, seemed to create some conflict with the greater goal of maintaining public trust in an institution, VA 2014 being a prime case? And then a related question to that is, I think the Lugar Center mentioned this too in their demonstration, that by nature of working on the Hill, being part of that rumor mill, as well as dealing with constituents on a day-to-day basis, we hear a lot of anecdotal reports and rumors, either about agency operations, either in the field or, you know, if you want to bring up the deep state hashtag, but you know, those types of anecdotal, you know, ranging from an individual veteran's experience to conspiracy theories. But where I'm going with this is how, when those get elevated to, say, a hearing level or to a communication with an agency, do you find that constructive or damaging to dealing with that agency? Because I feel like anecdotal stories do become part of the oversight process in a lot of circumstances.
Well, I'll try to keep this short because we've had a lot going on in the past 4 years. And when the big scandal broke in 2014, you know, we had multiple hearings, and they were nighttime hearings in order to get the full committee there, fully bipartisan. Every member participated, every member was fully engaged, and it was very, while it was hard to hear, it was very productive. But we did fear that, you know, any type of, you know, all of that coverage would keep veterans from using any of the benefits or services that they deserved. So, but in also kind of keeping it at the bipartisan level and trying to find solutions going forward, hopefully that didn't, it could be viewed as damaging, but I think in the long run worked out positively. I know recently we've had a few hearings on mental health and suicide prevention, knowing that that is still a huge issue in the veteran community. Both of those hearings, again, all the members were there, all of them were very engaged, but it also had a very kind of positive spin, using not just the agency, but also highlighting their partnerships with communities, partnerships with other veteran service organizations and nonprofits to kind of highlight what VA was doing as a result of this spotlight of being a very insular agency, and over the last 4 years reaching out, trying to build some of those partnerships and trying to build on what that crisis produced had a really, we got a lot of feedback from those two hearings about how uplifting they were and how positive and could actually serve as a greater incentive for veterans seeking out that type of mental health and suicide prevention help. So it took some time, and it kind of took a bad situation to eventually highlight some progress.
Anyone else like to comment on that before we?
If I could just, I don't know if it's going to answer the issue, but it took me a while to realize, and it was working with Portia and the others on the targeting issue, for me to really understand that the reason that there's congressional investigation and there are inspectors general is a check and balance. So the one thing I'd always tell my staff is, we get allegations every day about, the stories that you hear about IRS employees targeting individuals because of their political belief for enforcement, for example. Those allegations would come into us because we investigate alleged misconduct at the Internal Revenue Service, but they could also go to the Hill. So if we ever did a shoddy job and we didn't fully investigate it to the, taking it all the way down to the ground level, and that same individual went to the Hill and there was maybe Oversight and Government Reform looked at the same issue and they came to a different conclusion, could you imagine how damaging that would be for our agency? But because of that, I think on both sides of the issue, whether you're on the Hill doing the investigation, you know that there's an IG out there looking at it. And what would happen if there were competing conclusions? So I think in that regard, it's healthy to have investigations being conducted by Hill committees, but it's also healthy to have the Inspector General community out there doing independent investigations. I retired after 32 years, so I've served under 6 presidents, and I could tell you my colleagues, we're independent generally. We may vote ways, but this notion that somehow I was planted under the Ronald Reagan administration to then come back to life, come out of my cocoon and then do things, or vice versa, that's really difficult to imagine. Especially once you get into serving America and the taxpayer, you really do. That's the most important thing to all of us. And I will tell you that if there is ever anybody who would be trying to take it that route, I think there are enough of other people that just want to do the right thing that would be brought to light.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Ann Laurent, and I've spent 30 years covering government in a variety of different ways. So I've been watching my career pass before my eyes as you've all been speaking, because I've written about every single thing that you've brought up. I'm interested, I'm not entirely sure how to ask this question, so let me just give a shot at it. I once wrote a piece called The Tyranny of Anecdote, actually, and it was about the VA, interestingly enough, and about the difficulty the VA had in overcoming its bad reputation. And this was back in the Clinton era. The VA used to lose patients and find them dead on the premises in the wintertime long ago. So they had a bad reputation to climb over, and did, and then somehow lost it again. And that's all been happening in my career. So the one thing that's been a constant for the VA and for virtually every one of the agencies you've been talking about is that in various moments, members of Congress have stood up and basically grandstanded using the findings of investigative efforts on the part of IGs, sometimes the Hill, sometimes GAO, and others. And they've used anecdotes, and the tyranny of those anecdotes has caused there to be action taken about those agencies that may or may not be positive action. And I'll also say, having rated the performance of government for 4 years at one point, the management performance, Congress creates an awful lot of problems for federal agencies as well. Not least among them that it gives them competing directly opposing things to do. Manage the forests like a business. Oh, and also manage them for recreation. You know, and a whole raft of other ones. But the bottom line is, there's a thing about members of Congress grandstanding that I think works directly against what you all do and what the folks inside of the federal agencies, I'm not pointing at you, but the folks who are inside federal agencies are trying to do. And to what degree do you have any say-so on either the appetite for risk amongst your members, those of you who have members, or your overseers, and the reining in of the impulse to spread anecdote and grandstand on anecdote? Because honestly, we're entering into yet another period where the anecdote will be extreme and will exercise tyranny unless somebody else does.
Do you want to take that? Looks like Alan
Well,
steps
I'll-
up
I'll-
to the mic.
I'll attempt to comment. If you do a good investigation, and often will involve a case study. Okay, that's the nature of oversight investigations, to do an in-depth investigation. And so the notion behind that is you pick a case study that you can defend as a subsample of some greater issue that needs to be addressed by the Congress. So, you know, the anecdotes will rise and fall in the quality of the investigative work. So if you've done the work and you can back it up and you staff the members correctly with, you know, in terms of the statements, how the information is reported or portrayed to the public, that will be powerful enough. If you're right, that'll be powerful enough. You won't need to grandstand or stand on your head to get attention. If you've done the right work and it's compelling, it's going to happen. So that's what we aspire to. Might not always happen, but that's what we aim to do from where I'm sitting.
And I'm about to bring the panel to a close, and I think that's a very hopeful way to think about both the topic of this panel and oversight in general. So thinking about this whole day is really everybody working towards the good, the greater good. And so let me wrap this by asking each of you, and Ellen, we'll start with you and head this way, to share a tip or a myth that you'd like to see busted, or a best practice that's going to improve collaboration between the branches on oversight.
Very quickly, I just want to mention a couple of examples of collaboration we've had at our committee under our oversight auspices. Talking about the GAO, we've requested the GAO to look at the cybersecurity programs of certain agencies in our jurisdiction. These are very intensive audits. They're not like the other kinds of cyber audits that they get. And so these are in-depth audits that will reveal a lot of problems, and to the uninformed, you know, it could look really, really overwhelming. So one thing that's worked rather well is, as GAO is doing these audits and they're finding issues, that they inform the agency in real time. Don't wait to issue the report. Get them to start fixing it right away. We've helped facilitate that as an honest broker, because that's getting a little, you know, that's not something GAO typically does. But we've gotten some really positive results that way. So that's one thing I would point out. Another is working with the EIG. So for example, the Inspector General's office at HHS has had a number of outstanding and longstanding recommendations to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on a variety of issues that have been out there. We attempted as a committee to go to the IG and say, identify for us out of these longstanding recommendations, what are the low-hanging fruit? Give us a subcategory of things that you think that CMS agrees with and could address relatively quickly if they're focused on it. They gave us, I think, a pretty reasonable list. We turned to CMS and said, take a look at this and see what you can do in a year. And that's helped knock out a number of unimplemented recommendations. And we're learning, too, as to why some of the recommendations are taking such a long time to implement, or maybe, we're learning other reasons, learning a bit more on both sides of the ledger, the challenges with it. But the good news is it's having, again, a positive impact. And the last thing is, I work with the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. That's where we have witnesses sworn under oath, under the Klieg lights, and you got a lot of close questioning, even looking like a cross-examination at times. Occasionally, we've had situations, particularly at the very beginning of an issue that's of very strong interest to our members, where they want to do something on a particular issue, some matter in public health, but they're not sure what direction to take, but they want to immediately start signaling to the public that they're starting to take some action, but trying to lay a foundation and figure out what the best path forward is to crafting an oversight project on. So we came up with the idea of, instead of starting off with a hearing that wasn't really conducive to an open, a really open discussion and more of a learning exercise, we came up with a roundtable that was public, where the members were not on the dais. You'd have a table like a rectangular in shape, and we'd have witnesses, some from the executive branch, some non-executive branch, academic researchers, regular folks who were impacted by the particular health problem, and most of this was about the members who attended listening. So instead of the hearing where the members are doing most of the time asking questions or making speeches, most of the roundtable was about the members listening and learning from the witnesses. And by the way, the members were scattered about. They weren't divided by party. So you could have a Republican and a Democrat sitting together. It was a totally different dynamic, and was meant to facilitate a discussion from the witnesses to teach us, tell us more about this problem. We want to do something about it. We're not sure which direction to go on. So that's more of a collaborative approach that we took a look at.
That's great. It's a nice best practice. Thank you, Tim.
You just build on what Alan has said. I've participated in one of those roundtables, and in my whole career, that was the most invigorating experience I had, because, as he points out, the members were just spread out amongst everybody, and they really just wanted to learn what we knew about what was going on at the agency. I would just say that, just like everything in life, relationship building has to be intentional. We're all busy. Everybody has something they're trying to get done. The time to build a relationship is prior to a crisis, because then when the crisis occurs, you're ready to take action. But it has to be intentional. You have to build it into your time and schedule, and you have to be very thoughtful about it. We talked during the panel about opportunities for the legislative branch to come out into the field and meet people, or to see opportunities where there's some equipment, unusual activity. But it has to be an ongoing, intentional thing, and especially now when we're all so busy. But just when you go back and you think about it, no matter where you sit. Just think about opportunities that you could have. You have to build it in, you just have to make it part of it, because it will pay dividends down the road.
Thank you. Vince?
Congressional hearings are a dramatic stage for contemporary issues, where they're discussed in a public forum for our nation. It's healthy. My view, though, is 98% of oversight happens within agencies working with congressional committees, with GAO and OIG. And from the executive branch's perspective, we are healthier and stronger when there is senior leader involvement and accountability and an understanding of what the process is and what agencies are doing to be responsive to our overseers. 2, when there's ongoing communication, so we in the executive branch are providing what our overseers need to do their job, and evidence after the report has come out that we've actually done what we agreed to do in response to that investigation. And 3, that there's follow-up. Even when you think you're done, make sure you're done. And then pause, go back, and start that cycle over again. I mean, this is sort of like what we learned in first grade, right? You know, if the teacher says do something, you make sure you understand what you need to do, you get it done, and after it's done, if you didn't get the grade you want, you figure out why and you fix it moving forward. We need to have that same approach and understand that at the bottom of this, we are all doing this for a stronger nation. We may not agree on all issues, but we do agree that we need to have a strong country. And that's really where I think I've always found my strength is a career employee, where I really wake up every morning and I'm excited and proud of what I do, even on the tough days, because I understand that I'm a tiny cog in a very big machine that is trying to make our country and our world a better place.
Thank you. Portia?
I think I will end where I began, which is just to remind the folks who are in the oversight space that the parties to oversight, being the Hill staffers and the executive branch officials, are not enemy combatants. This is intended to be a collaborative process. And I think in order for it to work effectively, I think I would encourage the Hill staffers to remain open-minded when they come to an oversight question and to not form an opinion at the outset of an investigation. I think that makes oversight really tough when you go into an issue and you've already decided this is how I think this works, and you're not open to being convinced by where the facts lead you. And on the flip side of that, I would say to my agency colleagues, when you see an email come in or a phone call come in from a Hill staffer, don't put on your war gear, but instead view it as an opportunity to build a relationship, as folks have said today, and to try and get to a place of transparency, because, as has been mentioned by the prior panelists, our ultimate goal is to make sure that the programs that are in place are operating at prime efficiency. And sometimes that process might be challenging and tough and difficult, but I think we all have the same goal of making sure that the federal programs that are in place are operating in the best way possible. And the only way that we can do that is for Hill staffers and the executive branch to work together.
It's going to be tough to be any more eloquent than the four before me. I would reiterate on the roundtables. We have found those to be extremely valuable. Members talk to rather than talk at. Kind of takes away that grandstanding and an opportunity to educate. Tim mentioned earlier, the bottom of all those letters that go out asking for either a hearing or an investigation, there's a phone number and a name at the bottom. If anyone has questions, or just reach out and get more insight as to what really is being asked, and again, that relationship just needs to continue. And other than that, recognize that, kind of as Portia said, Hill staff, agency staff, and as Vince said, everyone is really trying to do their job for the best of America, and that's the bottom line. And I don't think anyone really There may be political aspects to things, but at the end of the day, everyone wants a better government and a better way of life, and that's. I'm done.
And that's a great way to end. So there is a demonstration across the hall, the Sunlight Foundation's Web Integrity Project. The next keynote is at 3:40 with Kim Zetter, Matt Blaze, and Jason Abel. And with that, thank you all for being here. Huge thank you to our panel. Really appreciate it.